think so.
Okay.
But if anybody is, my apologies.
We'll keep it civil.
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay. All right. Okay. This could be all right now. Okay. What's life with without a bit of panic before you actually start to do something, you know?
You're just underlining my
practice
point
this.
about how challenging those hybrid meetings are.
Practice this a few times, try to make it, try to get it to be routine. I wrote the steps down. It still doesn't work for me. So, okay. But I think actually with 30 seconds to spare,
it's now
really
saying
good.
Live on YouTube.
This is good. Okay. I think, this is quite positive.
I'm not yet seeing, oh.
And
there we go.
Okay. And you might even see this, I'll just put this up for about 30 seconds here. Okay.
It's up there, Jeff. I can see it.
This is good. I think everything is okay. So I will, as a technician, get out of the way. Wish you both a great presentation, and thanks for your patience with getting this set up.
It's all good. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the February 2023 meeting of the Ottawa Horticultural Society. I'm just delighted tonight that we're going to hear from Dr. Anise Dobson about her research into the invasive jumping worms. Now, Dr. Dobson grew up on a farm outside of Cobden, Ontario, so her horticultural roots go deep, and they grew in Ontario soil. After completing her PhD at Cornell University, she began a position as a postdoctoral researcher at the Yale School of the Environment. And her research has been focused on the impacts of jumping worms, white-tailed deer, and other stresses to native plant communities in northeastern Canada and the United States. She's currently working to identify the movement of jumping worms through New York City and assessing their impacts on urban plant communities. Now, so far in the Ottawa area, we're lucky we do not yet have jumping worms, but I know that they have entered Canada and they're a growing concern in parts of southwestern Ontario. So I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Dobson, and I'm going to now ask you to share your screen and take it away, Dr. Dobson. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. How are we looking? Hasn't loaded yet. Yeah, looks good. All right, great. Okay, thank you everyone for being here virtually. And thanks for the introduction and about my Ottawa Valley roots. Growing up on this farm in the Ottawa Valley really has, had huge impacts through my life and the types of questions that I ask in my scholarship. And so when setting out to study earthworms, and I think that this might be true for a lot of you that are gardeners or farmers or things like that, that the same traits that make earthworms so good, the things that we love about them as gardeners, can sometimes, in some contexts, make them so destructive. The same traits that make them so good can make them so bad. So people often ask, are earthworms good? This is what they want to know when I study earthworms. And what I want you to think about is that this is too simple of a question, too broad of a question to be really all that useful. So I want you to keep three things in mind when you're thinking about this question, are earthworms good? So not all habitats are the same. This is the farm that I grew up on. This is my mom right there. And this is a nearby old growth forest. So these habitats are really different, and what they need and the players in them need different things. So the farm field gets plowed regularly, and what you're putting in there is fast growing annuals that can take advantage of rapid turnover of nutrients. And if the soil conditions aren't right, the pH is wrong, the nitrogen is low, you can use fertilizer and different amendments to change that and modify it so that it's just perfect for your plant. But on the other hand, when you're talking about a forest, these are going to be mixing really slowly, and mostly that's going to be done by fungi and other players in the soil food web. And it's going to be consisting more of slow growing perennials. Some of those trilliums you see are, 70 years old, just growing really, really slowly in the understory. And instead of being able to get nutrients from fertilizers, they really are relying on a lot of mutualists, so things like mycorrhizal fungi, to get the nutrients that they need. Okay, so not all habitats are the same. And of course, as you know, not all plants need the same thing. So two common things that you might see in the understory, poison ivy, false Solomon seal, they need really, really different things, and they grow in different ways. So your poison ivy, it grows quickly. It has really flexible life forms. So you might see it as a vine, you might see it as a shrub, you might see it just growing in the understory. And it can seek out microhabitats. So it can cover a lot of ground to find what it needs to grow. Versus something like some of our native perennials that are going to be slow growing, long lived, highly dependent on mutualists. And they've evolved in these really organic, rich, duff understory conditions. So the third thing within that is that not all earthworms are the same. We've got a whole bunch of different species in Ontario, almost all of them introduced, a couple of them native, but even within the introduced ones, they're all over the board. So you've got jumping worms, that's in the family Megascolacidae. You've got your lumbricid worms, those are the night crawlers and ones that you're more familiar with. Composting worms are in that group also. And then we do actually have, I believe, two native earthworms in Ontario, but two, maybe three, I can't remember exactly. Two or three. And they need really, really different conditions as well, tending to be in coarse woody debris and in bogs. And so for the native worms, they're pretty rare. So in fact, we're worried about the invasion of some of these, we're worried about conservation of some of these other ones. So a little introduction to earthworms in Ontario. as far as our best guess goes, that the last glaciation that covered a lot of North America would have pushed out any earthworms that were here. And the native earthworms have been pretty slow to recolonize back across here. And so in Ontario, we have this phenomenon, or throughout North America, that I call global worming. And this is a small group of those 7,000-ish earthworm species out there in the world that are really good at invading habitats. So this can be temperate habitats, tropical habitats. And it's really different ecological situations that they're moving into. So in some places, they are displacing native earthworms. In other places, like in Ontario, maybe displacing earlier invasions by those lumbricid species. And then in some places, they're also invading new habitats where there have been no earthworms before. And this is what it looks like in a schematic. So let's imagine this one on the left is Algonquin Park, way up in the top of Algonquin Park where there's no earthworms, sort of your example of an Ontario forest 600 years ago or so. And what you're getting is all of the leaves that are leafing out on the trees are falling and are being decomposed much more slowly and much more shallowly than they are now. And so what this means is you get that duff. If you've ever walked in any of these forests, it's very fluffy, very, very organic, lots of fine roots. And if you're to look into the arthropod community within that, it's really rich understory, lots of tree seedlings coming up to replace any trees that are falling down. When invasive earthworms move into this system, they're mixing that duff layer up and you get a pretty homogeneous soil profile. And with jumping worms in particular, this top looks really, really different than historically. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So honing in on jumping worms in particular. So they're in family Megascelesidae. And in Ontario, we've got 3 co-invading species that look pretty similar for the most part, pretty hard to tell apart. And they're coming in from East Asia and around the 40s in New York State and neighboring states in the US, really slowly expanding, but then a bit of a population explosion over the past 10 to 20 years in sort of the northeastern United States. In Ontario, they were first observed in southern Ontario in 2014. We didn't hear much about them for a few years. The last couple of years, there have been a ton of sightings in southern Ontario, possibly one in Peterborough. But as was mentioned at the beginning, as far as I know, nothing past Peterborough. So this is, you all are the front lines of this invasion. So any observations that you make are really, really important to understanding their spread. So I'm going to give you a little video of what they look like, since hopefully most of you have never seen them. So they move across the soil in a really crazy way, and they can get to these really, really high densities that you see here. It can be pretty alarming. The other thing that I want you to notice, is the consistency of that soil. Just go back a little bit. Yeah, the consistency of that soil really, really looks quite different. So the key things that they do is re-engineering the soil, right? Earthworms are ecosystem engineers, and there's all sorts of downstream effects from that. But this sort of Algonquin Park type soil, uninvaded by earthworms that you might see, this is what it looks like in real life. So lots of leaf litter coming down, slowly decomposing. Some of this might be 10 years old, some of this might be 100 years old. And there's really stratified layers. With the lumbricid earthworms, it looks much more homogeneous. You've got mixed up soil that kind of looks like garden soil. And then with jumping worms, you get this change to a really gravelly type soil that has these really large aggregates and is really, really unstable. I've heard so many analogies for this that are pretty useful. I've heard ground beef, spent coffee grounds, nerds candy. There's more, but any of those that ring particularly true to you when you're looking at the soil, that's the key thing to look for. And also the key thing for understanding what these impacts are. So jumping worms are moving in, they're mixing, they're mineralizing that organic duff horizon. And what this means then is that the soil dries out really quickly, heats up really quickly. It's got reduced carbon storage, and these aggregates are really crumbly, large, loosely assembled. And so another thing that means is that you're going to get erosion happening that can cause a lot of problems. So this is one of my sites in New York City. The whole sort of bank is eroding down away from these steps. And when this happens along ditches, the castings tumble down and they get lodged into drainage. So stormwater drainage, agricultural drainage, and then ultimately has potentially impacts for drinking water. We get a lot of calls from the impacts to grasses and to fields. So golf courses is a big one. They've been doing lots of research on getting rid of earthworms for many, many years before any of us were thinking about it. But, you know, if the plight of golfers doesn't bring a tear to your eye, a lot of recreational fields in New York City, sort of the outdoor space for a lot of people there, a lot of kids there, is really being impacted by jumping worms. But we're mostly here to talk about plants, right? So if you're changing the soil to this really crumbly, gravelly textured soil, you can see for the first thing, there's very little growing in this. This is in the forest understory. This should have all sorts of things growing. You can see an exposed root here that's going to dry out and die pretty quickly. But when you change the soil like this, you got low germination, roots desiccate, so drying out really quickly, and unstable rooting. So you can just pull a plant out with very little effort. The roots don't stay adhered into the soil, which makes weeding easier, but, you know, not great for other things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research on how jumping worms impact plant communities. And we're working in New York City, which is a nice natural experiment. Some of the places have jumping worms, others don't. And this was a partnership with New York City Parks and Natural Areas Conservancy, which meant that we could do a really huge survey of 1,200 plots in New York City. And one thing that we did was we laid down these plots to look at various measures of the understory plants that you see with and without jumping worms. So what I want you to notice here mainly is the difference between these two lines. So this is going to represent the percent cover of native plants that you get in those plots. And even in, you know, New York City, that you don't think of as necessarily this hub for native plants, you're still seeing about 25% cover of native plants without jumping worms. The plots with jumping worms, that cover of native plants falls to about 10%. So you're seeing a really huge difference here. Invasive plants, it's exactly the opposite. You see pretty high cover of invasive plants when you have jumping worms, and invasive plants tend to be a lot more suppressed without jumping worms. But that's just looking at sort of the plant material in the plot that you're actually looking at. But there's another measurement that we did, which is measures of diversity. So this is just species richness, just the number of species in one of these 1 by 1 meter plots. And so very similar to before, if you're talking about native plants and you have no jumping worms, you get higher diversity of native plants. With jumping worms, that diversity goes down by about, down to about 1.5 one and a half species in that. What's interesting is that you also see a decline in invasive plants, right? So you're even seeing less diversity of invasive plants when you have jumping worms, which is kind of interesting. Within that category of native plants, though, there's all sorts of different types of species that are responding in really different ways. So you see things like poison ivy and Johnny Jumpseed that can handle jumping worms. So again, this is poison ivy. It's got those that stoloniferous growth where it can sort of cruise along the soil looking for a place to put its roots down. It can handle the unstable rooting conditions. Johnny Jumpseed has an interesting strategy. It grows up quite tall, but in those unstable rooting conditions, it topples over, but then the stem can then have shoots coming off of the stem that create more plants. So it's sort of walking as the plant grows up and then falls and then sends up new shoots, and does really, really well when the ground is unstable. But then a lot of the perennial, slow-growing native species, the kind of charismatic species like Trillium, those are the ones that really, really get displaced when jumping worms move in. And they have really, really different roots. They've got, for the most part, rhizomes and lots of storage that's going on right at the surface. And so like these are growing pretty shallow, and they rely on this year-to-year storage of nutrients to be able to continue growing. So when you stress out that shallow soil, when you stress out roots in that shallow soil, you see these species really get hit very hard. Another thing that we can do with some of these places that we work on is look at how jumping worms impact plant species with other stressors present. So the big ones that we have down here in New England, pretty similar to the ones up in Ontario, we have invasive plants. This is one I don't think that you have in Ottawa, Japanese stilt grass. We've got jumping worms, and then white-tailed deer are in really, really high abundance. I know for a fact that you've got a lot of those. And we see some really interesting things. So this is, again, our Solomon seal. This is our native perennial plant. This is one that we want to be growing in these parks. And what we see is that up here, these are the plants that are growing with deer, but at really, really low jumping worm densities. And they tend to survive just fine. Over here, what you're looking at is plants growing with jumping worms, but they're fenced off from deer, and they're also growing fine. So the plant population can handle one stressor or the other, but when you have both at the same time, that's these dots down here, you get complete local extinction of this Solomon seal. And when we look at how stiltgrass and, so that's the native plant, and jumping worms interact. So this is another species that we look at, zigzag goldenrod, and that their survival here. On this axis, we're looking at jumping worm density. So lots of jumping worms over here, very few over here. And the different colors, that's the different cover of stiltgrass. So at really low jumping worm density, all of the plants are doing just fine, no matter what kind of cover of invasive plants you've got. But as you get into these higher densities of jumping worms, the plants can handle it if they don't, the native plants can handle it if they're not in competition with invasive plants. But you see the population going almost to zero when you've got lots of cover of invasive plants. So just the jumping worms alone would be one thing, but when you consider them with some of the other stressors that plants have got to deal with, that's when things really, really go wrong. So I know that this is a horticulture group, but if you'll bear with me, as you know, plants are the foundation of a lot of the other ecosystems. So I'll just whet your appetite with a little bit. a little bit of the downstream effects of this. So when jumping worms modify the soil, remove that duff layer, it's not just the plants that are being impacted, it's all of the other herbivores and fungivores and predators that are living in the soil itself that are impacted. And then all of the larger things that rely on those to eat nutritious and diverse food. You're also, when you're changing the plants, you're going to change the understory composition. So that's important for ground nesting birds. It's important for migratory birds that need the more nutritious native plants to get through their migration. So the food web is being impacted by jumping worms through sort of all of these different compounding pathways. So from this work in New York City and New York State, we concluded that jumping worms are associated with the dominance of a small number of invasive species, not all invasive species, but a few of those ones are really, really benefiting from jumping worms. And when you combine this with other stressors, jumping worms are associated with local extinctions of some native plant species. All right, so preventing invasion. The spoiler for this section is that the management options are very limited once jumping worms are established. So this makes what you're all doing, what you're all going to go out and do this year, carefully looking at soil every time you go on a hike, every time you're digging in the garden, and being really vigilant for these things is going to be the key thing. And I want to give you a little bit of a hopeful story here that will hopefully bolster why you're going to be so careful looking for jumping worms. So I'm going to give you an example from New York City that is this transportation and shipping hub. When invasive species show up, they often show up in New York City first. So it's a good place to study them. One place that we know for sure jumping worms were brought to New York City was for the platypus exhibit in the Bronx Zoo in 1948. I've got this copy of Life magazine with like an 8-page spread on the platypus exhibit. People were totally obsessed. And so they documented all of the things that they brought over for the platypi to eat, including jumping worms. And so we know for sure that they were in New York City in 1948 in some places. They were identified in natural areas, so they had escaped into natural areas by about 1980, but we don't really have any data on how far they had moved. The first time that we did any kind of a survey for them was in 2013. And at that point, about 12% of those 1,200 plots that I'd mentioned had jumping worms in New York City. Now, when we went back to survey in 2018, 2019, that had gone from 12% coverage to 64%. So just a huge boom in a really, really short time. And so we've been racking our brains about what is about why this has happened. And I'll walk you through a couple of ideas. So one of them is that Hurricane Sandy happened right sort of at the same time as this explosion. And in New York City, this was about 15,000 trees downed in the storm. And what they did with a lot of those trees is they had trucks, they chipped them to use them as biofuel, landfill cover, mulch, things like that. And they had best management practices for all of the invasive beetles that they were thinking about at the time. But jumping worms was just not on anybody's radar at all. And nobody knew how they spread. And so unfortunately, one of the things that they did with this mulch is they piled it up into one single pile and then moved it out to all of these different parks throughout the city after that. So this could very well be one explanation for that explosion. But right next to the Bronx Zoo is this is this old growth forest right in New York City called the Thane Family Forest. And if you walk through there, it's got almost no jumping worms, some sort of at the edge, but almost none. And it's very perplexing, right? It's been since 1948, we know that they've been next door, but they haven't moved this 1 kilometer over to the Thane Family Forest. So that should give you some hope that some of the things that you can do have an impact. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what they're doing so right, because they do all the things right to prevent jumping worms. So it's an old growth forest that hasn't been logged. They chip their own mulch on site. They propagate their own plants on site. They're mostly using bare root plantings if they're bringing in anything from outside, and they have deer completely excluded from the property. So one or all of these things are probably the explanation for why they had not had jumping worms move into their park. Now, this is only one possible explanation, right? We have not tested this. This is just sort of a hypothesis that we have. There were also some big urban tree planting programs that happened in that time. There were some high moisture years. So there's other things that could explain it beyond just the mulch pile and mulch movement. But that does seem to be, the movement of mulch does seem to be a key thing that we're thinking about. So the reason that I told you that story about the Thane Family Forest and the Bronx Zoo right beside each other, one with jumping worms, one without, is that quite often when we talk about invasive species, it's so depressing, right? Things like the chestnut blight that also showed up for the first time in the Bronx Zoo just spread over the United States and knocked out the American chestnut in a decade or two functionally from the forest. Spread through wind, and now any chestnut really anywhere in North America is going to be hit by the blight. But not all invasive species just move by themselves so quickly. So the emerald ash borer, we really slowed the spread of that. We didn't stop it, but by changing how we move firewood and how we move wood long distances, we really slowed the spread of that. And what I want you to think about with jumping worms is that they're kind of on the far extreme from chestnut blight. They move a little bit themselves, but they're almost entirely moving because we are moving them. So some modifications to our behavior and how we move soil, how we move mulch are going to have huge impacts and really stop or slow the spread of jumping worms. So this is a map that is looking at where jumping worms could get to based on their thermal tolerance. So in theory, they could really, get up here into northern Ontario, northern Manitoba, some pretty big coverage. This dark gray is where they could be. These dots, this is where they are as of 2018. And what was really interesting, I mean, now they're in Ontario, but for about 75 years, the border did a pretty darn good job of keeping jumping worms out of Ontario, better than most, I would say probably most invasive species. And one of the reasons for that is that it's really hard to transport soil. It's really hard to transport mulch over the border. So these are some different ways that jumping worms can spread, but I really think that soil and mulch are kind of the key things to look for. They're also spreading through waterways and ditches, things like that, compost, yard waste, potentially a little bit less so, but also possible through tire treads, bait, and even in your hiking boots. And this is just a plot from New York City, what the density of jumping worms are if you're right next to a mulched path or not. So some things that you can do is thinking about where you're getting your mulch, your topsoil, and your compost. I forgot to change this to Celsius. I was giving this talk to an American crowd, but I'm sure you can figure out what that is in Celsius. But just simply heat treating your mulch or your topsoil or your compost if you're concerned, to not a really, really high level, but that can kill off any worms or any eggs. And then also explaining to businesses that this is important to you is really key, because jumping worms aren't there yet. I've worked with them all across sort of parts of New England and North America, and people are never worried about it until it's too late. I've just seen it happen too many times. So telling businesses that this is important to you is really key. The best option is if you can make your own mulch, your own compost on your own property. Here, where I'm living in Connecticut, you can just flag down the guys going under the power lines, cutting trees, and have them just dump mulch onto your property. I don't know if it's quite that easy in Ontario, but if you can get mulch that kind of goes straight from the tree to the truck to your yard, that's awesome. The trouble is when the mulch gets piled up and is sitting for a long period of time, get infested with jumping worms. Especially for many of you in Ottawa and the Ottawa area, making sure that that mulch is sourced locally, not coming from Southern Ontario or the United States, would be really key to do. Even safer than that, thinking about planting bare root. Or if you, bare root has all of these other good reasons to plant bare root also. But even if you get things in soil that you're concerned might be infested, you can just rinse the roots. Cocoons are going to be visible to the naked eye, and so you don't have to like disinfect them or anything like that. It's not like working with COVID, that you need to be really super, super careful. If you just rinse the roots and make sure that there's no visible soil on them, then that's probably fine. When you do get any seedlings, just make sure if you pop them out of the pack that you're looking for something like this and not something like this. It's making sure that you don't have that really weird texture, kind of ground beef, nerd candy texture when you pop the plant out of the pot. And if you're a community, if you have any kind of community plant sales or something like that, you're concerned about spreading jumping worms, this is just a little visual of how you might do that root washing. So removing it as much as possible. And then the key thing is straining that water, getting rid of the solids or freezing and then throwing away the solids. And then you can dump the water. Another thing that you might think about doing, especially maybe if you have a plant sale or a garden center, is super cheap. Just get some of these plastic cones, put them on the legs of your tables so that the worms can't crawl right up the table legs. Kind of like what you would do for keeping squirrels out of your bird feeders. So in New York State, there are laws against moving invasive species and selling invasive species, including jumping worms. But one thing that the agencies have found is that it's really, really hard to implement that. So top-down solutions, putting laws on moving jumping worms are pretty difficult because they're hard to identify, they're hard to see, it's in the soil. So I'll just reiterate this again, like shopping local, communicating with businesses, if you're working with, family operations and talking to them and telling them that this is important to you, that they're taking these strategies to make sure that they're not getting jumping worms in their crops can be really, really effective. Another place that we've seen jumping worms move in is from big logging and landscaping operations. So when you're moving soil on these treads here, this is northern Manitoba, tree planting days, making sure that you have something in your contracts that specifies that you want any of the gear, any of the vehicles to be just sprayed down before you come to your site. There are some examples of this that you can find in the US if you just look up like the language to include in these contracts. And this is also going to be really good at keeping out invasive plants or invasive pests. There's just all sorts of things that can be transported in soil if you're moving it from site to site. So putting in a stipulation to come in with clean gear and clean equipment can pay dividends. Another one for any of you that use worm composting systems, making sure that you don't have any jumping worms in there that you're spreading. So if you buy worms from some less reputable places, they might have all sorts of different species in there. So when you get your worms, you want to just take a look and make sure that they have these yellow bands, these sort of tiger stripes that you might call them. And those are going to be your composting worms that really are the best for compost. And they're, while they are not native to North America, they are European, these composting worms. They do tend to just sort of die off in the winter, don't move too far from their compost home. So these guys are not really an ecological concern. But if you've got some jumping worms that are in there, then you don't want to spread that compost. Making sure that you're not dumping infested yard waste into natural areas. This is not yet a huge concern in Ottawa because you don't have jumping worms yet, but just making sure that you're taking care of this yard waste, sort of not just by dumping it next to a natural area. So I wanted to just put this in here. Ontario does not have any regulations against jumping worms that I'm aware of. New York State just put in this new policy in 2014, 2015 that included invasive animals, and you can't knowingly sell them or spread them. Otherwise, you can get a warning or a fine. If you're talking about nurseries, in theory, this has not happened before, but in theory, if you keep reselling jumping worm infested plants, you can get your business license and certification revoked. So it's really something that you don't want to get into your business if you're in any kind of horticulture business. Really tricky thing to navigate. So other things that you can do, learning to recognize the signs. At this time of year, you won't be seeing any jumping worms, but you will be able to see this really modified soil all year round. So this is something that is really key to look for. If you want to visually expect for jumping worms, this will be in the late summer, early fall. And they're usually going to be right sort of at the surface, right under the leaf litter. You don't have to go digging very far for them. You usually see them. They're about the size of a big night crawler, about the size and about the shape in this sort of end of summertime. But there are some ways that you can tell them apart. So on this side, we've got the jumping worm. On this side, we've got those lumbricid earthworms. So they're both going to be pretty darkly pigmented, but the jumping worm is going to be kind of having a metallic sheen and pigmented all throughout the worm, kind of purple from nose to tail, versus the night crawler that they have these really deep burrows that can go down like 2 meters. And it's really just their heads that spend any time up above the surface. So they've got really dark pigmented noses and top of the front of their body. And then their tails are going to really be lacking in pigment. They'll be quite sort of beige and have this flattened beaver tail that's pretty distinctive. If you've got an adult that you're looking at, that can be really helpful. In the jumping worm, this clitellum is going to be really close to the nose of the worm in like the first 10% of the body, versus in the lumbricid earthworm, it's going to be much closer to the middle, or like 1/3 of the way down the earthworm. The shape of the clitellum is also going to be really key. On the jumping worm, it's sort of smooth and goes all the way around the worm, versus in the lumbricid worm, it's a saddle shape. So the clitellum is just sort of on the back of the worm, doesn't go all the way around. If you want to identify a jumping worm to species, it's going to be extremely hard and impossible most of the time. So we can send this around if you want to have the key to do it. But you need to look at these tiny little dots here on the worm and count how many they are and where they are. So it's pretty challenging. We'll more often do DNA barcoding to figure out what species it is. But one thing that you can see is also looking for these setae that go all the way around each segment of the worm. So if you do think that you see a jumping worm, and this is going to be really important all throughout Ontario, especially in Ottawa, especially anywhere out of Southern Ontario, but really anywhere in Ontario, is a pretty new thing, really just taking off in the last couple of years. So government agencies and scientists in Ontario are sort of reeling with what to do. So any information you can provide through EdMaps is a good one. iNaturalist is a nice one to do too. The kind of information links up, it'll come to people either way. There's also the invasive species hotline that you can call. And invasivespeciescenter.ca has a really great informational website about jumping worms that I highly recommend taking a look at if you want to know a little bit more. And another place actually that is really almost the most locked in on the jumping worms that I've seen is the Master Gardener's Facebook page. So that would be, if you're not already a part of it, that would be one to look at. There's a bit of biocontrol and other research that's happening, but none of it is at all ready to go. So with chemical or biological control, you got to put a lot of research into making sure there aren't other downstream impacts. Remember, there are those pesky, rare native earthworms that we really don't know what using biocontrol is going to do. If we're thinking about using chemicals like saponins is a kind of promising one, that is, it's sort of a soapy, detergenty compound that comes from seeds. So if you've ever had quinoa and you've rinsed it, kind of that frothy, bubbly stuff that comes off of quinoa. But even though that comes from seeds, comes from a natural origin, we need to test out what that means for if it gets into the waterway, what that's doing to salamanders. So there is a lot of research that needs to be done before any of these are things that I am ready to recommend. The other thing that you can do is, especially now before you have any jumping worms, is thinking about mitigating damage. So you can't get rid of the jumping worms, but maybe you can get rid of the invasive plants. Maybe you can protect your gardens or your natural area with fencing, or take up bow hunting or something like that. So managing the things that you can and not the things you can't. Since you are all ahead of the curve, another thing you could do is think about the species that you're planting in your gardens. Deep-rooted species by far and away do much better than most of the sort of medium or shallow-rooted species. So establishing these now can be a great idea. Jumping worms and their impacts are usually just in the top 30 centimeters of the soil or so. So if you've got plants with very deep roots, that's great. Pollinator gardens tend to have a lot of the species that are in pollinator or prairie gardens do tend to be some of those deep rooted species with quite matted roots. So in addition to the other ecosystem services that they have for birds and insects and mammals and things like that, people with gardens like these, even when they do get jumping worms, the plants do still seem to flourish, and they tend to get lower densities of jumping worms moving in. We're doing ongoing research to identify other plants that can survive with jumping worms. So things like Jack in the Pulpit have a lot of chemical protection against jumping worms. Trout lily has an interesting strategy where it can sort of pull itself back into the soil. If there's erosion that happens, the roots get exposed, it can sort of pull itself back in. And then a lot of ferns tend to be able to do okay with jumping worms, and we don't really know why. That could be another strategy of things to sort of, if you're landscaping, thinking about some common native ferns to put in. And I mentioned early on that poison ivy was one that did pretty well with jumping worms. I may not be able to convince you to landscape with poison ivy, but other things that grow kind of like poison ivy, that sort of cruise over the surface of the ground, like native partridge berry, is one that you can experiment with, or other ground covers. All right, so that was what I wanted to say. I'll just give a quick thanks to the people that have funded this work and are working with me on it. And I think that we are ready to take some questions.
That was absolutely fascinating.
And right on time. I didn't even practice.
Bonus points for that. Well done. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Jeff, first of all, if there are any questions coming in on our email or text.
Rebecca, yeah, and thanks, Dr. Dobson. No questions by email yet, but we'll see if they come in.
Well, I have a number of questions on the. I have a number of questions myself, actually. I don't know if this is true, but I heard a rumor that the jumping worms at one point had been introduced as fishing bait. I was fascinated by your story about them coming into the Bronx Zoo to feed the platypuses or platypi. Were there other avenues as well, like fishing bait?
So people do use them for fishing bait, but I think that it is a good way to tell the real people who fish from the people that just like to tell tall tales about fishing, because jumping worms, you would think they would be great bait because they're big and they thrash. So you look at them and you're like, oh man, a fish would love that. But actually, if you put it on the hook, it sort of drops. It can drop its tail. It can drop part of its body and still survive. And it just doesn't stay on the hook at all. And fish don't really like it. Kind of moves weird. So it's really, really bad for fishing. But that doesn't mean that people don't still try. And they do survive just fine in the water. So if it gets itself off the hook, it's going to go into the water and it's going to climb up on shore somewhere else. So yeah, people do sometimes use them for fishing, but don't be tempted. They're no good.
Okay, that's really interesting and kind of scary that there's that other avenue or pathway for them to spread.
Yeah, and actually, I'll go on the soapbox for one more thing about fishing and earthworms. So I'm talking about jumping worms. This is one thing that we're really concerned about right now. But those lumbricid earthworms, the European earthworms that have been here for longer, they're also pretty destructive in forests. And there are a lot of forests in Canada that they're not yet in. So if you've got a fishing trip up in Algonquin Park and you're thinking about bringing even the regular night crawlers into the park, I would really urge against doing that. Going into remote areas, just not bringing any earthworms at all, using something else for bait.
Good point. Thank you. As you were talking about the plants that do okay with jumping worms
Mhm.
and the ones that don't, and also the impact of the jumping worms on other animal life in the soil, the other biota that lives there.
Mhm.
I was wondering, I have bloodroot in my garden and I have extremely sandy soil, and of course I have lots of ants.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the bloodroot spreads like weeds because the ants take the seeds and they want that little dollop of fat on the seed.
Yeah.
And they bring the seed into their burrow, eat the little dollop of fat, and then they chuck the seed out, and lo and behold, I've got another bloodroot plant. Is there any research about how the worms are impacting things like ants that might also help to spread native plants?
Yeah. In fact, I was on a call just today about this exact thing that we're doing in one of our projects. Unfortunately, the people that are doing the sort of soil community analysis are totally bogged down because the places without any earthworms just have such a rich diversity of mites and pseudoscorpions and all sorts of things that it's taking them like months instead of weeks to wade through the data. But I think that almost certainly that is going to be the case. Even with the lumbricid earthworms, when they move in, you just see a total crash in the diversity, the abundance, everything in the sort of arthropods in the soil. And so I really think that is that's going to be a huge concern for things that rely on ants to move their seeds. It's bloodroot, but it's a lot of our sort of charismatic perennial species, and I think I think you're right on with that for sure.
Well, that's unfortunate. Yeah, they're really quite a terrifying pest, aren't they?
They are, yes.
Now, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that relationship between the white-tailed deer and the jumping worms. I get that it's, you put the two together, the plant communities are going to be extra stressed. But the way you were talking about the deer, it almost sounded like they would help to spread the worms.
That is a hypothesis that some people have, and there's some evidence that if you fence deer from an area, you see lower populations of earthworms. I think in this case, it is more a fact that a lot of our plants have strategies to deal with deer that they've co-evolved with. So you've got a deer and a trillium, right? So the deer goes through, takes a big bite of the trillium. That's it. That's all the green leaves for the year for that trillium. And so what it's going to do is it's going to go dormant for the rest of the year. It's going to take all of the nutrients and the carbon that it's stored up, and it's going to bring it into its root, and it's going to take some time off, just take a little break, and then try again next year. And that's the strategy that has evolved with so many of these plants, having big storage organs to maybe take a year off and go dormant if you need to, or whatever. Some species that maybe like Jack in the Pulpit, it'll be maybe female one year, maybe it'll have a bad year. And then the next year it'll come back and have a male flower, or then it'll come back and have no flower and go back to being a juvenile. So they have all of these ways that they hedge their bets and store their energy in their roots. And so what's going on in the soil is just going to have such a huge impact on the plant's ability to deal with what's going on above the soil. So I think that that's the main thing. There's all sorts of other explanations, but that's the one that I think is the most compelling.
That's fascinating. That's really interesting. You had some wonderful mitigation strategies there. And of course, like a lot of horticultural societies, the Ottawa Hort Society does 2 or 3 plant sales a year. It's a big source of revenue. It's our main source of revenue. I'm just wondering, is it too soon for us to start selling our plants bare root? Washing the soil off the donations and sieving it.
I think that probably that is a good question. I think it's probably premature to totally repot the soil into, I think it's probably premature to do that. But giving everyone who's out there digging up their plants to then sell and share, just making sure that they're aware to look for jumping worms and that they don't have any other invasive plants in that area. Just being cognizant of the soil that you're taking the plant out of. I think it could be a great practice to, get some soilless media or something like that you take the plants and you put them into that to then sell. But until there are jumping worms in Ottawa, I think you're probably safe to not go through all of the protocols.
Okay, well, that's a relief, I can tell you.
Yeah, it's not a huge effort. Like a lot of people do go through the root washing process down here in the US for plant sales, and it's okay. The volunteers get together for an afternoon. They got like a everyone's got their little task. It's kind of fun. So it's not the end of the world to do, but I do think that maybe making sure that people that are donating their plants or whatever are just checking for the signs of jumping worms and invasive plants before they pot them up.
We already have a thanks but no thanks list for invasive plants. So
yeah, love that.
Guess we could,
yeah.
Guess we could add the watch out for the ground beef or coffee ground type of soil texture.
Yeah.
That would be another giveaway.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, is it relatively safe if you're planting your seedlings into a potting mix that you've purchased, like a sterile potting mix? Is that fairly safe?
Yeah. So like a bale of Pro Mix that is dry and doesn't have holes in the bag, hasn't been sitting out on a pallet getting rained on, I've never seen a jumping worm in that because it's so compact that they really can't get in. If it's like been sitting around for a long time, you get holes in it and things kind of crawl in. But if you've got like a dry, compact Pro Mix, that you can assume that that'll be safe for not having jumping worms.
So our seedlings grown in Pro Mix or something like that are going to be good.
Yeah.
Well, this was just absolutely fascinating. I'm going to take one last look and see if we have any more questions. And I think that's just about it. But wow, forewarned is forearmed. We're definitely going to be hoping for those biocontrols to come out soon. And in the meantime, we know what to look for, and we know the protocols to use to try and prevent the spread of this really nasty invasive. So many thanks, Anise. It was a fabulous talk. I'm still totally creeped out by the graphic you've got up on there.
Sorry, I should have gone back to
there you go. There we go. That's a much more reassuring image. Thank you so much again. It was really a wonderful, wonderful talk. Really fascinating to hear from you about your research and really get the latest, get all the dirt on the jumping worms, if you'll pardon the
good one. Get all the dirt.
Many thanks, and have a wonderful evening to everybody.